Good afternoon, everyone, and lovely to see you all here. I can see at least a couple of people that are taking advantage of the sunshine this afternoon and sitting outside listening to this. I have to say I'm actually very jealous because I've just closed my door to avoid any background noise. So you may see the sweat start to break out in my as I'm sitting in my conservatory for the next hour with the door closed. But isn't it lovely having some sunshine just for a change? Anyway, having done that very British stereotypical thing and talked about the weather for a couple of minutes, let me now introduce the webinar instead. I can see lots of new names this afternoon, which is lovely to see. So let me introduce myself for those of you that don't know me. My name's Emma Parry. I'm a Professor of Human Resource Management here at Cranfield, and I'm the head of the Changing World of Work group that hosts this webinar series. So we've been running this series since September. This is the second time that Perry has kindly come and done a session for us. Delighted to welcome him back today and to welcome you all to the Changing World of Work group community that we see these webinars have been part of. I'm not going to talk for very long because I want to pass on to Perry, but there are a couple of things that I do want to say. Firstly, as Perry has kindly changed the slides, to something that's gone a little bit strange, I think, in terms of the font size, but never mind, it's bigger, so that's always a good thing. Just before I forget, just to promote our next webinar, it's always good to do the advertising at the beginning of the session. The next time we have a webinar, if you join us, you will have to listen to me, I'm afraid, and we are going to talk about something that's a little bit more provocative and really challenge the whole idea of generations and generational diversity. And myself and my colleague, Professor Peter Irwin, are going to talk a little bit about why it's time to jack that idea completely and really stop talking about things like millennials, Generation Z, baby boomers, and so on and so forth. But going back for today, it's a great pleasure to invite and welcome Perry back with us. Perry Timms is one of our visiting fellows in the Changing World of Work group and a great friend of the group. And of myself personally, I'd like to think. Perry and I have been doing lots of work lately looking at organisation design and creating a programme for the school based around organisation design. So I wanted to get him along today to talk about something that's not unrelated to that and really to think about something that I know Perry could probably talk for the rest of the week about, but really to spend the next hour talking a little bit about Agile. And agile approaches to organisation design and to managing people. Before I pass on to Perry, I just want to congratulate him because this book, which I waved at him a minute ago, which is Perry's latest book, has been shortlisted for the, what is it, Perry?
Business Book of the Year 2020.
The Business Book of the Year. So just to say at this stage, congratulations, Perry. We're all very proud of you.
Thank you.
And it's a great book from the 2/3 of it that I've read so far.
Excellent. Good.
So it's great to see this. And just to thank you as well, Perry, for coming back with us today and sharing your insights with us. So without further ado, I will pass on to him. Just to say, sorry, as you can see, this is being recorded. This is so that we can put this up on our website and YouTube channel. You will have had to press a button approving that, so thank you for doing that. If you're still with us, you must have said yes to recording. And also just to say that I will be tweeting, so if you are on social media, please feel free to share your thoughts about this webinar and to use the hashtag Changing World of Work. On the first slide, Perry's moving.
There we go.
Thank you, Emma. That was very agile of you.
Thank you very much. Yeah,
okay, cool. And without that, I'll pass on to Perry.
Thank you, Emma. No, genuinely a pleasure. And you're right. I could literally talk about this for a week non-stop, perhaps. And today you might have to remind me to take a breath because I can just literally get on a roll with this. But yes, we'll look into the prism of the future. So I've grandly called it responsive systems of work, uncertain times, mastering your agile evolution. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So Emma's kindly introduced me, so thanks very much for all that. Yeah, that book actually, when I pressed send and submitted it to the publisher, I genuinely had this thought, was that the book I wanted to write? I really had my doubts about it. So I am genuinely gobsmacked that it's got to that stage of where it is. And so just the fact that it's there is good enough for me. So a little bit more about the company that I set up in 2012. So we're called People and Transformational HR. PT doesn't necessarily stand for me, but it kind of does, I suppose. What we stand for, better business for a better world. So I think, when we look at things like political systems and social systems, business has a lot it can do to help us recover and become a much more civil society. So we stand for helping that happen. We are a pending B Corporation certified organisation. Look that up at bcorp.net if you want to know more on that. We're also a gold status 4-day week employer. We operate on Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays and Fridays. We have Wednesday as a non-working day without any adjustments to pay and reward. We're a living wage employer. Just credited on that, and as Emma said, the book's shortlisted. So these are people we work with, and as you can tell, I've got a little bit of an obsession about ordering logos in colour sequence. So the green's down there, the blue's at the top. But yeah, we work with charities, non-profits, local government, central government, tech startups, retail brands, you name it. So we're not discriminate about who we work with, but the essence of why we end up working with people is they all want to help us to help them with a little bit of this. People-powered change and innovation, agile and autonomous and inclusive work in the topic of today, bit of design and systems thinking that Emma talked about earlier, and then helping people rediscover that kind of energy, zing and zip in work, and look at org design and business models and strategies. So nothing unique about that, but we're very interested in that sort of progressive way of thinking and perhaps slightly unorthodox approach to work and business. But I'm going to start with a little bit of a shock to the system, I suppose, about where we are now. So this is a graphic that comes from the Institute for the Future. So I've put the link up there. Emma will send out through the team a copy of these slides so that you can check on some of this later. And if you've got any questions or observations, you can pop them in the chat and hopefully I'll be able to pick them up. But I guess this was a really nice frame, I guess, of some of the things that I guess we're starting to see coming through in the world, with growth, collapse, transformation and constraint as almost being polarizing or competing forces, and some pretty deep-rooted things that aren't just pandemic related but have happened and are all kind of taxing us in our approach, I guess, to what the 2021 version of the world, both in a work and life sense, is. So, we're not short of challenges, I guess, is what I'm saying there, but I'm not being glib about that. I'm just saying that lots of them are very systemic, lots of them are very sort of societal level, and work in itself is in the mix quite significantly about either recovering from that, helping create some places of safety, and or rebuilding some trust with people. So yeah, lots to do. So my first, I guess, kind of assertion is that we are uncomfortable, or we should be at least uncomfortable about where we are. And so what I mean by that is, if you are feeling a little bit lost, discombobulated, uncertain, unsure, well, welcome to the club, because I think pretty much everybody is. Even down in New Zealand, perhaps, where they've handled the pandemic in a very sort of responsive and solid fashion. I think even Jacinda Ardern will probably say, look, there are lots of things I'm not comfortable about in terms of the future and how we, kind of create the right conditions to thrive. So yeah, I don't think anybody's devoid of any of that. And so if we look at what that means to us, then I think what we're talking about is the fact that we've got something in here around a space in between. We are dealing with what's called liminality. So we're in transition, we're in between. There's something happening where it's not the former recognized thing that we're used to, and it's not quite yet the next stage. So the metamorphosis hasn't been and kind of come to life. So I guess we're in a situation a little bit like the chrysalis or the pupa. So if we are feeling a little bit uncomfortable, disconcerted, that's partly why.
We're on this transition, as I said earlier. Transition from headset mics to not. Okay, so a couple of little bits of sort of science, I suppose, that are helping us understand the context of this kind of liminal space. So if we take work to its almost like component parts, it's kind of made up of two things. Productivity, which is about efficiencies in process and about resource utilization and so on, and also what's called stratification, the categorized levels of human social systems and dynamics and so Now, in the world of work as we know it in the 21st century, it still has many of the hallmarks of the world of work from the 20th century and even the 19th century. So the almost structural framework, scaffold, whatever you want to call it, is still pretty much in place from perhaps a couple of 100 years old systems. Now, certainly in the last 20 years, what we've started to see is a lot more of that kind of production engineering excellence and human behaviors almost like come to a different level of understanding. Yet organizations, as I've put there, they're still over stratified. Many cases 7+ layers of bureaucracy. So you've got junior staff and then a whole layer of hierarchy above. And I guess what we're starting to see now is that the most efficient for a responsive and dynamic version of a working structure? Many people in the sort of academic world and in the practice world would say not any longer. It's too calcified, it's too slow, decisions take forever. So we've got this kind of challenge that in a world where we need to be whitewater kayaking, we're still trying to build dams. So I guess that's the sort of metaphor to leave you with about how we can start to think about the conditions, I suppose, of work. Now, here's a big old history lesson for you. And if you don't know anything about Agile, we can track it back to 1851 and the philosopher Auguste Comte, who commissioned the first study of the social behaviours and interactions of people in the workplace. So bear in mind, this is sort of post Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, and into Frederick Winslow Taylor hadn't even come on the scene yet. So we're on early industrial Isambard, K. Brunel type principles here. And Comte was fascinated not by industrial processes, but by human interactions. And so he started to create what we now know as sociocratic systems. If we go through F.W. Taylor and into work improvement systems, we can see in the 30s, 40s and beyond. I'm not going to read every single one of these out, but we've had almost decade-based iterations, adaptations, systems and different things coming in. And many of you on this webinar have probably got black belt, Six Sigma, Kaizen certificates and project management Prince 2 qualifications, all sorts of things. You'll probably recognize a lot of these and go, well, hey, yeah, I've been through that. That's kind of my professional accreditation journey. But if we start to look into the early 2000s, and of course the difference in the early 2000s compared to previous incarnations of the world of work is that technology was a much more regularized force because we had the internet. Quite significant amounts of traffic on the internet, of course. So we've now started to see how people have experimented with systems of work that are to do with web and commerce-based interactions that are now driven by machines, driven by connections, driven by automation in a different way. And I'll just draw your attention to a couple of things at the bottom of that, where we can start to see Agile coming in around about 2001 with a group of software developers who met in Salt Lake City in Utah. And if we follow it through, you can also see the advent of things like l'entreprise libertaire, the liberated enterprise, Isaac Getz, Brian Carney, studying organizations who detach from hierarchies, who worked in incredibly nimble and agile and responsive ways. Through to a couple of new titles from Gary Hamill from London Business School and Michele Zanini, who wrote a book called Humanocracy, and Aaron Dignan from New York, who's done lots of consulting in organizational design, who wrote a book called Brave New Work. So if you want, we've got a trail of things that are showing us how we got to where we are in terms of the work systems and the social systems that are at play at the same time in our working lives. And so if we move on from that, we'll start getting into the nub now of what we're talking about in mastering your agile evolution. And the first thing is know where you are. That might sound a little bit kind of twee, but let me explain. This is a concept that's on that chart, and it's called Cynefin. Cynefin, for those of you that are from Wales, is a Welsh word loosely translated in English to habitat, but it really kind of means where you are. And for this, we're talking about contextually rather than physically. Now, this came from some work in IBM in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and kind of perfected into this version by a former consultant engineer, Dave Snowden, at IBM, who started to bring together some entities of sort of space and circumstance and situation built around things like systems theory and complexity theory and so on. So what was starting to happen is that how we act sometimes depends on where we are contextually, so what's going on around us. Now, just to give this a bit of light, we've clearly been in that chaotic space, because about a year ago we were told by government, right, that's it, you can't go to work anymore, schools are shut, we've got to do homeschooling and work from home. Now, we had to act to that because that was a piece of prescribed legislation, and we had to make ourselves safe. So there were all sorts of things we didn't know we needed to know, because we'd never even thought about that at that scale before. So we had to commit to what's called novel practice. We had to act first, and then we had to go, right, I've done something. Now, is that the right thing to do for this circumstance? What am I sensing is the productivity or the reason or the rationale that I'm acting in this way? And if you don't feel it's right, you get the chance then to understand and sense a way into a responsiveness that might change and adapt. So the early days of schooling at home might have been a complete disaster, but then probably next time round in the lockdown, you're a little bit well versed, and so it wasn't quite so chaotic. Now, we find ourselves in chaos sometimes by our own determination, because we have planned and we've kind of let things get on top of us, but often it's external forces that create that sense of chaos. The one thing about working in a chaotic space, it's adrenaline fueled, it's potentially quite exciting, and sometimes innovation bursts out in that space. But it's also incredibly tiring and potentially quite dangerous to operate in a chaos space all the time. So we can move from chaos even directly into something that's simple and clear if we've made that transition, but often we find ourselves moving up into that top left corner of complexity, where, as Donald Rumsfeld once famously said, there are known unknowns and then there are unknown unknowns, talking about responses to unknown threats. So here we are in a situation where there are still a lot of things we don't know, but we are in a less chaotic space, so that we can perhaps probe rather than simply act. We can research and kind of safely look into things before we can then sense what's right and respond. So there is not quite the red alarm button that's been pressed in this space, but it's still pretty complex. It's still where we don't quite know exactly what to do. And I think a lot of us are currently in that space. So it's emergent practice that wins here. We have to do some experiments in order to reveal something in order to then act. And then over in the top right is where it's a little bit more predictable, but it might not be any less complicated. So it's the difference between complex and complicated, because here at least we know what we don't know. So this is where we've got multiple perspectives, data to analyze, all sorts of things that are combining to us, where at least we know we don't know them yet, but we can sense and analyze them in order to formulate a response. And so organizations are often in a complicated box, especially if you're in a sort of global organization with a number of different products and services and a different sort of cultural dynamic. So that's where good practice comes in, because we have to use data in order to adjust our behavior. And then where a lot of us like to be is where it's clear and we know what we know, and we can sense that and we can categorize that and respond to that in a replicable, scalable fashion. And that's when we have best practice. So when I say we need to know where we are, that's part of it. Now, you'll notice the squiggly lines on this one. It's not a deliberate kind of 2x2 with some hard borders. You can be a little bit in chaos and a lot in complex and a bit in complicated with a certain area. You're not restricted to mapping yourself into one zone or another, because multiple factors may be at play. So it's just a chance to plot where you are, to understand what actions and what data and what, I guess you'd say, sort of analysis you need to do in order to respond and choose your action. Okay. Now, this is knowing where you are actually. Now, this has got perhaps a little bit more complicated since a year ago. But to be fair, this was possibly part of the makeup of the 2019 version of work. There was still some people working from home. There were still some people working in satellite offices, coffee shops, and so on. But it's a little bit more pronounced and a little bit more kind of regularized now, I guess, because of the experience that we've had. And so knowing where we are actually is also quite important, because we might need to start to think differently about how we can deal with the work sort of venue, the situation that we find ourselves in, and the place where we do the work. So yeah, we've got lots and lots of conflicting reports at the moment saying everybody's going back. No, nobody's going back. Only today, I think HSBC have announced they're getting rid of their executive floor. So the plush carpets will be on eBay, no doubt. So that's the first thing, know where you are, both contextually and physically. And then the next part of your Agile evolution, and this one might ring true with a lot of us, know what you mean by the term Agile. I've been into lots of organizations who've said, oh yeah, we work in an Agile way. So I'm expecting to see scrum boards and all sorts of things, and it's hot desks. Now that's kind of one version of Agile. So there's an Agile with a little a, and there's Agile with a big A. And the little a is the stuff that is about flexible or remote working. So what we've kind of exercised to the max really during COVID. There's also an Agile or an agility-based responsive mindset strategy. So this is where you're not operating in a very rigidly fixed way. You're a little bit more responsive to consumer demand or market trends or whatever it might be. So some industries that have fluctuating demands will probably talk about themselves as Agile, and absolutely they are, because they're reacting to external forces. So they're kind of built for that fluidity. But then the Agile with the big A is the one where it's about work, project and development rituals, tools, ceremonies, a different linguistic frame, and actually all about inclusive and pacey sprint-based working. So I'm going to cover a bit of everything during this, the little a and the big A. But my sense is, whichever way you use the capitalization, it is perfect for this complex, uncertain era of work, because we are experimenting, we are having to adapt, and we are having to get there quickly and inclusively. And so I wrote a white paper with HR Zone last year with software company UKG, where we looked at agility, not just Agile methodology, for HR and people professionals. So if you're in that game, these are the sort of archetypes we were talking about. Flexibility of approach, that's been tested significantly, as I said, potentially using digital connections more than we perhaps ever have. Review, recast and reset protocols and processes. So the phrase I quite like about this is that everything's in perpetual beta. So it's not quite a finished version ever. So there's something about that. Creative ways adapting to unorthodox situations. That's about imagination and workarounds, which many people in the sort of research area of professional capability are saying are as valuable as compliance, if not more so. And then we've got additional factors like continuous learning, decision-making, standards, which can shift and change and adapt. So agility very much is about not fixed, but equally not left completely undefined either. So it's about adaptive, responsive processes. And so then the Agile with the big A, the methodology conceived, like I said earlier, in Salt Lake City, and it was a group of software developers who were incredibly frustrated by the system that prevailed at the time, which was largely what we know as waterfall, large cascades of huge chunks of activity which deliver a software program. And they wanted to break into a much more responsive system themselves. And so these were their kind of edicts, I suppose, on their manifesto. Individuals and interactions, not just processes and tools, recognizing people and how we deal with each other. Work in software, not just comprehensive documentation. So I self-confessed to being a project Prince 2 qualified person back in the 90s, and actually I probably spent as much time on documenting the system as I actually did helping build the system, which, whilst you could say that was a very helpful sort of way to set out what you needed, we didn't have a product to show users for weeks and weeks and months. So this is all about having iterations and versions that can help people more dynamically build software. Anyway, we're not talking about software necessarily today, but this is where its root is. Agile as a software development concept has multiple applications, because I've been using them for years now in the non-software world. And so HBR featured an article in May, June 2020, largely drafted by some consultants at Bain & Co, who were actually looking at an Agile C-suite. So they were saying, look, this stuff can help us at the highest level, because they were recognizing pandemic responses were such that they couldn't be fixed and they shouldn't be left to chance either. Interesting use of wording on HBR's schedule here. You've got static and chaotic. So they've sort of used a little bit of Dave Snowden's Cynefin language there, because static could be the clear and chaotic obviously is that. But then look at the static, soulless targets, authoritarian, rigid bureaucracy. It doesn't sound very nice on that left side, but then it doesn't sound great on the right side either. Vague and fickle, undisciplined, haphazard, anarchic. So they've tried to give you a scale really by saying, look, as a leader, you will probably need to find yourself moving a little bit further away from the left into the right, but don't go too crazy because you've still got a business to run and certainty to create where possible. But I think they're recognizing this sense that actually as leaders, you've got to sort of expand your playbook and your routines and the way you approach decision making and the systems of work. And they've kind of shamelessly lifted the Agile Manifesto and dropped it into a version that's fit for the C-suite. So yeah, it's kind of going into that realm. And in fact, I did some research in 2016 for my first book and found a software company. It's quite a big one. There were a few hundred people who work there, and their leaders' work was put on a scrum board outside the main office space, so people could see what leaders were doing. So they adopted a very agile approach to their work. So if that's 2, then knowing what you mean, then 3 is knowing how to start. So once we know what we mean, are we being agile with a little a, with a bit of big A, or what? Know how to start. And so here's the kind of story really that Agile has at the heart of every single project I've ever seen and worked on. You got a problem, and that problem needs a solution. And Agile is a way to close the gap between the two and create the solution. And solutions are nearly always products. So by products, that doesn't mean a physical built thing, but it might be some guidance, some comms, a policy, a learning program. It could be whatever. And products have owners. And the one thing I love about Agile is that it doesn't put the ownership into a board or a committee or some nebulous entity. It's a one person who stands in the space and says, when you've built my solution, I will be the one to receive it. I will be the one to replicate it around. So you have a single owner. So that's kind of useful to have that sense of ownership. And that owner has to have a vision. If they know what the problem is, they have to have a vision at least of what good looks like in terms of a solution. How you get there and the components and features of it, that's down to you. But the correction of the misalignment or the problem is something they'll have to help us with by at least setting our destination of arrival there. And that vision becomes a product story. So we build a story about the thing we're building, so we bring it to life. And that's driven by people's needs. So people, whether they're directly impacted by the problem, whether they're contributing to the problem, or whether they're a little bit incidental but are interested in the solution, they have stories themselves of how they interact with it, what they need from it, and what they can shape for it. So we create user stories. And from those, we've got a list of requirements and specifications and ideas and opportunities, and we create those into a backlog of tasks so that we can work on those to build the product. All the tasks, we need to size them so we can allocate them and understand the chain that's going to lead us to delivering that. So we call that velocity and sequencing. How quickly can we get there and in what order? And then once we've done that, we work out the sprints, which set out little gateways where we can do iterations and builds in a gradual sense so that we're not just staring at some huge Gantt chart that makes our spine shudder. And then we set out a roadmap. Well, what does this look like as those sprints start to evolve, and how will we get to the point where we've completed it? And in between, we have these rituals and ceremonies that keep us on track, help us to adapt, test theories, and build our capacity and capability during the process. And that leads us to then reviewing that very regularly, and then we just weave that into our next cycle. So it's a really nice compacted way of saying there's a start, middle, and end, but in the midst of it, there's quite a lot of activity. And so there are some key principles that help us. The first one is the key word enough. Lots of people say, where do I start? It's like, well, you need to start with enough that you can know about an agile process so that you can actually start doing it. So you need a little bit of learning, but you don't need to go on a 3-day Scrum Master course or anything significant, just enough that you can start doing it. In the Sky Learning and Development team, they started to experiment with Agile for their sort of learning solutions. And for the first few months, the head of L&D there said they were making an absolute mess of things, but that was a great way for them to learn. They weren't harming anybody. It was just they were stumbling and mumbling through it, but they found their perfect recipe. And then quite quickly afterwards, they became the go-to people for solving any business problems at Sky. So yeah, choose enough to explore, do enough to experiment and start to build something worth building, share enough of it so that you've got different perspectives so people can shape your version of Agile. and then scale it enough so other people can get involved. So you don't need to go all in, you don't need to keep it a total secret, but it is a good idea to contain it a little bit so that you can see how you can develop your version of Agile, because there is no one truth with Agile. There are principles, but your version will be different to everybody else's. And then the other key word to think about is intent. So the thing I like about Agile is it's quite democratic, and a principle I like, which is that it isn't just the usual suspects who are chosen to work on a working group or a project or an initiative, or badge holders or whatever it might be. Often it is about people who have the intent to solve that problem wherever they are in the organization. So we try and look at how we can get that as a real inclusive part of this process by calling out, assembling the team, giving them the skills and capabilities. And so it's not just your usual suspects. So good diversity of thought comes in there. And then be intentional about who's the owner, who's got the accountability for delivery, who has the actions, and how are decisions taken within that unit. And sometimes you can show how you're intending to tackle that hourly, daily, or whatever by opening up your work to being in full view of everybody else. So no hidden to-do lists in notebooks or inboxes. It's all about workflow that's actually open to interrogation by everybody, which works really well, especially if you're remote. And then things like meetings and governance and so on. It's not an excuse to do high-risk things by ignoring governance. What this is saying, well, what's necessary governance? What can we actually sort of focus on and then kind of cull, as it says there. So things like meetings and email exchanges become different, quicker, sharper, more intentional. So yeah, there's definitely something about how we debureaucratize within this process. And the unit of change that's really good is about teams. So there's definitely something in here about focusing on the team quite obsessively and making sure that we are, skilling that team, equipping them so that they've got the right components. So it's the best unit to experiment, work, and measure the impact. So yeah, it's a really good team environment. In fact, it's probably the best one I've seen. So let's find either a team that can operate like this now, or assemble a team to solve a problem from different parts, but give that team a real sense of focus and measure the impact of their work. Okay, so here's the people bits. Key thing is roles. The product owner I talked about. The Agile coach, so they don't have a project manager in Agile. There's nobody barking out the instructions and allocating the work necessarily. It's a coach who helps people by removing blockages, talking to people who need to be involved, keeping the team accountable, raising any issues, keeping them on track. So it's much more of a facilitative role rather than a management role, because the team are autonomous, empowered, enabled, and it's up to them to get on with it, and it's up to them to kind of help each other out if need be. And of course, they can call the Agile coach in if there's a bit of a discrepancy, but the idea is really that the team looks after itself, and the Agile coach is just an extra deployable resource that helps them with the process and the system. So very different to project management. So some of the principles then, working out loud so everybody can see your workflow. If you have a complex project, those stages I talked about, the stories, building a canvas so you've got it all on one page, those kind of things. So you agree as a team, how are we going to tackle this piece of work? So it's a very participative process as you get going. And then set up those sprints, and then you can use software to track your work if need be. So again, take it out of inboxes, take it out of notebooks, and put it in some kind of managed system so that we can allocate and show how we're doing. And then regularly have these kind of check-ins where we're showing progress by, the early draft of a report or the early stage of a learning program policy or a piece of software, so that we show people what we're up to rather than just tell them. And then we've got this whole sense of don't just pick your star performers. They're probably overworked anyway. And so there's something about role incumbents, specialists and experts. Bring them in when you need to, but maybe you don't need them for the whole project. So let people work on this who want to solve that problem. So if that's the case, then now we're looking at impediments. So we've had a look at where you are, we've had a look at what we mean, and now we've moved into some of the starting processes, but what might get in the way. So some people are a bit scared about it. They actually find particularly during uncertain times, that you've got to stick to what you know. And the idea is Agile is an unknown to many people, so they're just not comfortable. It does somewhat challenge people who like orderly, tightly controlled spans of influence and are very ritualistic about what they do. And people have been known to quote it as being an anarchic, a wasteful, malevolent process. So it's got a lot of people out there who will detract from it. Some people like power and position, and this is not disrespectful to power and position, but it also doesn't play to that exactly same dynamic. So there is definitely something about how this can be seen as a potentially challenging aspect of power and stability. People see it as a disruptive, discombobulated state, and they might say it's a bit messy. I mean, there are answers to all those things, which is it's not any of them, but people still don't believe it. So my experience is that these are things you'll get challenged with pretty much regularly by people who just don't kind of get or believe in the Agile way. And that's why I've put a few quotes. I mean, I'm not saying you use these as your defense, but John Maynard Keynes actually said the difficulty lies not in new ideas, but escaping old ones. Orthodoxy has a really strong hold on people. Heather McGowan, very pronounced sort of futurist. The slowest rate of change is the one that's happening now. Change in an accelerating sense is probably likely to continue to get quicker. And then I love this quote from physicist slash philosopher W. Ross Ashby about the law of requisite variety. So when the variety or complexity of the environment exceeds the capacity of the system, the environment will dominate and destroy the system. So I think there's something about our system hasn't exactly been destroyed, but it's been massively, massively tested. So yeah, so we've got to start thinking potentially about some of those issues too. Okay. So a couple of questions coming through, which is great. So so we know our impediments, so that's good. And proving the case for change then. So this is the one thing I find quite assuring for people who are a bit fearful, is that Agile doesn't mean that you're not aligned. Agile is not some off the scale thing where there isn't a playback or a readback into your existing systems. So when I worked in a local authority bringing Agile in, one of the first people to come to one of our learning sessions was the corporate lawyer. And I must admit my prejudice and bias towards corporate lawyers came through, because my reaction was, well, this is going to be trouble and really hard work for me, because I could imagine governance and regulations being thrown at. Quite the opposite happened, actually. Whilst there were a few questions about checking in back to governance, the corporate lawyer went back and actually got her own team working in a more agile way, because she could see that she was an impediment to people getting both experience and making decisions quickly. So it can have a good impact like that. But yeah, align it. It doesn't have to be counter to things like traditional reporting formats. If you've got red, amber, green reports, make a red, amber, green report part of your products that you build within Agile so that you can comply with whatever system is overarching for your projects. And then making sure that people are aware that what they need and how Agile works can even be adjusted in itself. So if there are people who can commit but not immediately, and you want to spread out your sprints, then that's partly what you'll do, if that doesn't jeopardize your deadline. So I think there's lots of alignment goes on in Agile, which people are really, really not sure happens, but it genuinely does. Planning is a quite obsessive sport in Agile. Not to the point that it's calcifying planning, that it stops you doing, but it's very much in the moment. And I found that you can manage multiple projects in an Agile sense, probably with more dexterity than you can in a slightly more traditional format. And then the key thing for me to get over those feelings of reluctance and therefore being an impediment is that you explore. So you experiment, you build something nice and contained, you try it out, you prove it works before you then show the results to other people and say, well, imagine if we adopted this in a few more areas, we could make savings and time and so on and so forth. So evidence revealing actually in an Agile project is probably a little bit easier than it is in a non-Agile project, because you have this constant attention to working out loud, to tracking accountability, and to showing the results of what you do and the retrospective reviews of how you do it. So I found this easier to do an impact assessment on than a traditional way of just getting a project over the line and then breathlessly going, brilliant, I'm on to the next thing. This is a much more nice, conducive way, I guess, of proving what you've done. And then the other thing to bear in mind is that it could be this lovely phrase, exaptive practices, which is how you repurpose things that don't quite work right. Agile isn't just about a new venture or a new project or product. It can be things that have just stuttered, failed, are in need of repurposing. So you can show actually how you can dust something down, polish it up, and then give it new life using an Agile approach, because it will definitely get you there quicker. Cool. So know where you are, know how to start, know your impediments, and then know your best space. So where you want to sort of practice and experiment. And then, of course, the space thing comes into this with this whole concept of a hybrid organization. So I just thought I'd touch on some of this, because Agile also means the venue, I suppose, as we talked about earlier on. Now, this is how we've worked to now. An experience base tells us that synchronous working, as in that diagram there, where we're all in as many as we can that are attached to a workstation, and then occasional, exceptional, distributed asynchronous working, i.e. we're not physically present at that time. Now, of course, that's been thrown into total opposites by a lot of the dial moving over towards distributed, but that's what we were used to. But the 3 Ps of work are now where I think we need to probably focus our triangulation on. So we need to be a little bit more agile about how we can adapt to new practices. And we are talking about people and culture, the place that we work at, and the process that's involved in that as a kind of triangulated element. And so it isn't just how many times do we turn up? It's like, what's the impact of our decisions on venue based on people and our process and technology that enables it. So it's definitely those 3 elements combined. And just to give it a bit more depth, this is where this, I guess, kind of comes in. We were leaning towards the synchronous, and then we moved heavily towards asynchronous. But actually our decision now post-COVID is potentially no longer on that scale, but in that 3rd dimension, where we can move much more towards a hybrid version of in, out, online, remote, synchronous, asynchronous. So if you see the descriptors there, it was all about office-based desks and rooms and files in cabinets and so on, and for those that remember that. And then the distributed version was everything online. Whether it was good or not, we had no choice. And now we've got choice. It actually is a little bit more complex than it was in the initial version, because everybody, at least in a knowledge work entity, was kind of working from home. So now we've got this sense of what can we do for the people who occasionally need to be there, and what do we need a building for? Why do we need to bring people together? You're probably like me and visited offices and saw lots of people with headphones in, trying to get work done, avoiding distraction. And you kind of think, so they endured a 2-hour commute and to sit there with the headphones on and minimally interact with people because all they wanted to do was get their work done. It's almost like that's a kind of misnomer for the venue. So I think we've got a chance to think differently now about what we do in a place and where we bring people to that place, what they do when they get there. So just some hints about things like social cohesion, about creative and structured work, mentoring, those kind of things. So I think we've got to re-engineer a little bit more than just along that scale. It's a 3rd dimension. So it might look like this. Monday, we do our stand-ups on Agile, we do our planning work, we do some creative thinking, we learn and mentor, non-standard stuff where we all come into the office. But then we agree as a team that Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, we're remote. So we have meetings, we can do some report working, do some research. So we start thinking differently about how we kind of calibrate our attention and our workloads. So that's a possibility. And then on Friday, we come back in again, and we absolutely start to do more of that kind of team-oriented stuff. So we've got this sense here that that's one model. And then another team who work in the same environment as us, they may take the decision to do Mondays, Tuesdays and Wednesdays all remote, and Thursdays and Fridays in the office, because that's how the team works. Now that's brilliant. Now if you're team alpha, you also know that team beta are in the office on Friday. You could do some cross-team work on Friday. So you can see what I'm getting at here. I think the unit of change or the unit of decision, if we have it at organizational level, it runs the risk of being just like the old version but more messy. And if we do it at individual level, then it's not like the old version, but it's still really messy. So I think there's something about trying to get the team to work out its best cadence, rhythm, venue, and so on. And then teams talk to teams, and teams who need to work together work out how best to deal with that venue-based stuff. and then the sort of remote stuff. And then we've got people, well-being, social connection, work productivity, creativity in a much better balanced mix. So it might look like this. Know where your work sits. So is it complex? Is it in a chaotic space? You know, if you're in some kind of high demand customer resolution role, that's kind of a bit chaotic sometimes. Knowing where that sits and then looking at the nature of the work, how can you start to think where's the best venue for it? And we can look at the high volume and complex work and start thinking about perhaps if we can channel the work, we could have the complex work dealt with when we're in the office as a team. We can talk about it, challenge and tackle it. And the simple stuff we can do whenever we're working from home. Routines, scheduling, blah, blah, blah. Things like team meetings. So I heard one organization who said, right, we're going to come in on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday and work from home on Monday, Friday. And so their instruction to their teams was on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, that's when you should book all your meetings. And actually people responded back and went, no, we'll do the meetings on Mondays and Fridays where we can, because Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, that's where we want to see people, do the creative stuff. We don't want to be stuck in meetings when we can do that through a video channel. So I think we've got some challenges to, like I say, a whole top-down approach, or and everybody choose a potential chaotic situation. So just to kind of give you a reminder, there's a third space now, and it is about, I think, inclusivity. It is about choice, but it is also about sensible decisions made on what work is and where it needs to be done best by people. And Agile will both sort of work in a remote environment and an in-person environment. So the good news is that doesn't necessarily get hindered by either version of that. So just to give you a sense of what a complex project looks like on screen, tasks, set to people with deadlines and measurements and parameters and all the things that I guess you know and love perhaps, or may not love from projects, are still at play within Agile. So it's not a departure from planned activities and predictability where possible, but it is a more responsive version of the system. So know where you are, know how to start, know what's in the way, know your best space, and create your infrastructure. And I think on that note, I can just leave you with some logos of people to look into who do a lot of this kind of more responsive and agile working. Big industries, small, creatives, heavy lifting, all sorts, and there's more. So lots of these companies are worth looking into. When you get a copy of the slides, just start to Google and have a look at their stories. And there's some books, mine included, and Linda Holbeach, Agile HR, Kareem Harbert's Business Agility, and Agile People. So there's some literature around. We run some labs. There's the team. And Emma's got another webinar on the 24th of May. So I'm going to stop there and just see if we've got 10 minutes for questions. I've seen a few pop up.
Loads of questions, Perry, I think.
Oh my goodness, we have. Right, here we go.
Quite a lot now. Do you want me to read them to you, or do you want to work through them?
I can work through them if you want, Emma. So Mike B said, how do you progress your career within agile environments? It would seem to me that it's easier to make lateral moves to larger projects, but harder to make vertical moves, as in up a chain. Yeah. One thing I will say is that things like agile coaches and scrum masters are high demand, high salary people. So there's something about that role itself being something to aspire to. I think the agile stuff I'm talking about is often where people are given practical, real life working experiences that can add to their capability and their chances of promotability. So I think it definitely helps you stack up a little bit more in terms of variety. So I think it can work like that. And I think as an organization matures and gets more agile in itself, I think having those traits, I think puts you in a good position to start to advance if that's what you want to do. And of course, there are some companies who do this at scale, who have an enormous agile infrastructure like ING Bank. So yeah, I'd say that it's not an impediment to that. And it's actually a really good learning opportunity for people to diversify. So hopefully that's helped you, Mike. What do I think about legal strategy? To what extent this strategy can be recommended in the present times of pandemic? Helene, thank you. As I said, there's a lot of alignment, and you should never ignore what's legally compliant in all sorts of ways. So I have known clients who've turned around and said, well, our policy doesn't really encourage internal mobility, so resources are quite locked in and quite specific. So they created a sort of a clause where people said, look, I'm willing to work outside of my professional domain and learn in an agile project environment, and I understand this is part of my development, so on. So they almost took a little bit of a disclaimer approach, which I found both odd and assuring in equal measure. So I think you can be legal and compliant with Agile. It's not at all anti that. Liam, COVID has driven an increase in collaboration. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, between business areas, and we're concerned that we will lose this when we return to a normal working pattern. Absolutely. Any suggestions on how to assess and spotlight how we capture this expanded Agile collaborative culture? Yeah. So I think all organizations are built often on those verticals. So what clearly happens is that work doesn't respect those, so it cuts across them in a horizontal. So I guess what we can start to see is, why did we operate in that horizontal fashion during COVID, and how can that be, I guess, brought into your more process and culture orientation about allocation of responsibilities and inclusivity, so that you do actually continue it. One way is the way that Spotify did their work, and also I found a printing company in Peterborough who did a similar thing. You create not just divisions based on vertical expertise, but you also create either some kind of guild or some kind of house. So in the printing company in Peterborough, they created houses built on Gryffindor and stuff from Harry Potter. So if you were in marketing, planning, finance, research, operations, whatever, you belonged to Gryffindor. And so you had a group of people who you worked with on your accounts and also on your development. And so they almost formed like a wraparound, so that people worked out of their discipline. And then those houses got quite competitive about products and about results and stuff like that. So I think you can create almost like another dimension that keeps that collaboration going. Projects are always good to work on for that. How do I balance minimum viable product versus maximizing value from DEEPM? A minimum viable product is only ever something to illustrate what the final version might look and be like, but you haven't got all the things ready to press go and deliver it. So it's an illustrative version of the product, because that might need to be tested by stakeholders, by users, by the owner. And so absolutely that's part of how you maximize value, because you don't release it until you know it's absolutely been stress tested by somebody who's got a very vested interest in it. So the answer to that, Deepam, is your MVP allows you to maximize the value of your final product. Helen, what's the best way to deploy Agile when detailed documentation is required for safety critical systems? Okay, so I do know of some Agile-based approaches that are working in things where they're highly regulated, both in engineering and production and even in healthcare. So what you do there is you make sure that the safety critical documentation is part of your product. And I mean, I bet you there'll be people who will work on it who will absolutely know that that's what you have to comply with. So you set out a series of expectations, and one of them is that you have to do the requirements per that. So a self-managed Agile team in the Northwest who deal with healthcare have to do CQC compliance, and they do. So it does work. Okay, to be successful, businesses say they need to adapt and change at frequency. What's my sense of this for the case to change from Improve 2020? Yes, I think the pace of change is such that it's the more noticeable elements of change are more prominent. So yeah, I think there is a case of, if we don't move quickly, we're even further behind the curve. So therefore there's more friction loss in our investment and revenue and likely success. So I think there's something about test and adapt quickly in order to make sure that you're not falling further behind, because it'll be even harder and even damaging. Do you have examples of creating punctuation to avoid the monotonous hum during home remote working? James has almost quoted my slide. Yeah, journaling. So journaling about your work helps you a little bit understanding what goes on. Bringing other people in so that you've almost got like a work coach or a work buddy or somebody who can help you understand what's on your day. We have a social channel in our organization. There's only 10 of us, and we use Slack, and we check in every day and we update. And so, yeah, it just breaks the hump. Are some functions, e.g. program management, already more agile compared to others, e.g. finance? That's from iPhone 12M. It's a good name to change. I think program management actually is sometimes agile, sometimes almost anti-agile. Sometimes it likes to control projects, sometimes it likes to see more projects deliver more quickly with more value. And I've been surprised actually how people in finance can often be very pro-agile. I saw some people working in pensions who made some significant changes to customer service because they wanted to experiment with agile. So don't let people tell you that financiers are all just hooked to spreadsheets and that's it. Oh, 2 minutes.
I have to say, Perry, talking about agile, I'm very impressed at the speed you managed to. I hope everyone that asked a question managed to catch the answer to theirs in that quick run through there.
Watch the recording back at half speed.
Yeah, because I wouldn't have expected you to get through all of those questions in the time that we had. We have one more question if you just want to answer it.
Oh yeah, how much training time is
normally acceptable for a team new to Agile?
Team of 30 to 35. So I think you can get them up to speed if you can release them all at the same time within a week. You can get them probably delivering their first Agile project in under a month. So I think you're only talking about 4 weeks to get those people really quite strong on Agile, if that's helpful, Nishant.
Good, thank you. Right, no, brilliant. Okay, thank you for slipping that last one in there. And thank you to everyone else for your engagement. I always have halfway through each one of these webinars, I always panic slightly when we don't have any questions. And then suddenly everybody asks lots and lots of questions. So I can see that you're all listening and engaged, which is fantastic for you. So thank you very much for that. It is 3 o'clock, so we will sign off. But just to say, of course, 2 things. Firstly, thank you very much to Perry. As always, it's a pleasure, Perry. Thank you for coming along. We will be putting the recording of this webinar on our website just as soon as we've tidied it up a bit. But thank you very much for that, Perry. I'm sure we'll see you again at some point. I certainly will. And then thank you, of course, to all of you for coming along and asking questions and joining. And please remember that we do have one of these webinars every month. So this is a series that we're hoping to continue. So please do engage, join us for the next webinar where you will get to hear a lot more from me. I'm afraid talking about one of my favorite subjects, why we should forget the idea of generational categories and use something else to think about how attitudes are changing. So we will talk about that. But also if get in touch with us at the Changing World of Work group. Get in touch with me if you think there's something that you really think we should be doing a webinar about, because we're here to serve and here to work with you, and we enjoy the conversations that engage people. So please do get in touch and let us know what you're up to. And with that, I will say goodbye. As always, stay safe, stay healthy, and we will see you all soon.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Perry.